All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Brumbach, and I am the Director of Marketing at Sequoia, and I will also be your moderator today. We have a great discussion planned. We will be discussing best practices in vendor selection and qualification for contracted manufacturing partners. And I'm joined by an incredible group of panelists here today. So I'm very excited to introduce them to you. They are very eager to share their expertise as well as their lessons learned in finding that right contract manufacturing partner. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started with introductions. We'll start with Dr. Teresa Henry, who is our Senior Director of Scientific Operations at Sequoia. Dr. Henry, would you kindly give us a brief background and share an overview of your expertise?
Thanks, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. So my background has been a little bit varied. I've worked in a lot of different industries over the years. I've been in medical device, diagnostics, pharma, biologics, food, even dietary supplements. But what I've found over the years is that everything ultimately ends up following the same basic premise. I've worked primarily on the quality control, analytical method development and validation side of the house, but good science, good quality is going to be good quality regardless of your industry. And ultimately, if we start to look at the similarities between those industries and the things that we can share and learn from other spaces in the industry, we're able to make really great strides very quickly. So I'm looking forward to chatting with all of you and seeing what else we can learn together.
Thanks, Teresa. Next up, we have Alex Yu, who is Senior Director of Quality at Hello Heart. Alex, would you mind also giving us a brief background and overview of your expertise?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex, and I have about 15 years of working experience in quality. And so through my career, just like Teresa, I've also managed quite a few different products, from pharmaceutical to medical devices, from traditional medical devices to those ones that are super high risk, like implantable devices that are radioactive, all the way until recently that I've been managing software as medical devices as well. And so my academic background actually is in AI and bioinformatics. And I often tell people that I did AI before it was cool. So it was early 2000s. When I graduated, there was practically zero jobs in that field. Unlike now, there's an explosive awareness of that field. The reason I mentioned that is because in recent years, I've been coming back into this bioinformatics field in the recent 2 years. I've been managing 2 quality systems in 2 different companies. One is for pharmaceutical and the other one is for medical devices, and both are using AI. This is AI and machine learning. This is one of those fields that have really gained traction in recent years. To Teresa's point about the general principles earlier, what I also find is that one of the invariable sort of themes in quality management is that when you do have a good quality management philosophy, it works for almost every product. And also to today's sort of topic as well is that one of the non-variable topics in quality management is going to be establishing that robust and solid supplier relationships. So this is one of those things that are essential skills for any quality manager that wants to be successful. So very happy to be part of today's discussion and look forward to the questions that you might have later as well.
Thank you, Alex, and we're so happy to have you. And last but not least, we have Derek Coops, who is the Vice President and General Manager at Cambridge. Derek, would you kindly give us an overview of your background and expertise as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. So Derek Coops, I'm the General Manager of the early development site here for Cambrex in Longmont, Colorado. I've been in industry for over 25 years now. Virtually my entire career having been spent on the CDMO side of the business. So working at those companies that you're partnering with to move these assets forward. Most of my career has been in different project management roles before I moved into business management and then into site management. So a lot of experience in project management. Primarily, I had worked at Patheon, which then became Thermo Fisher before joining Cambrex. I've always worked on the development side of the business. So I've done some time in biologics. I've worked in late phase development, going into commercial launch, a lot of experience with oral solid dose. The current site where I lead is a little bit unique compared to my previous experience because it's not only drug product, but at the site where I am now, we do both drug substance development and drug product development from preclinical through phase 2. So having the exposure to the drug substance side of the business has really been kind of an interesting change for me in the last year, and really seeing what having that all co-located in one location allows us to do from a flexibility point of view to provide solutions to customers as challenges come up has been really exciting. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, appreciate all of the introductions. We'll go ahead and get started now with kicking off with a presentation from Dr. Henry. So she's going to start with kind of giving us an overview of the fundamentals in the vendor selection and qualification process. So if you have any questions during Teresa's presentation, please feel free to input them into the chat. And at the close of her presentation, I will address them and Teresa can answer them for you. So take it away, Teresa.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I keep looking at the slide and thinking, mastering the science of successfully creating actually go back because I can't remember all of it.
There you go. It's a long title.
It's a very long title. And ultimately it's a very big challenge. And so what we want to think about is how do we break that down into something a little bit more manageable? So if we now move to the next slide, think about it from that old adage of how do you eat an elephant? It's really one bite at a time. And the same thing applies to how do we develop any sort of product for clinical use. There's a lot of things that go into it, and we need to break it down into things that we're actually able to do. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I kept thinking around food, probably because we use the term, how do you eat? But I was like, all right, so this really isn't any different than how you would pick a restaurant to have dinner with your family or friends. Next slide, please. The very first thing we need to do is we have to decide what we want. Do we want Indian or Italian or maybe Thai? And then we need to stop and think about what makes sense from a restaurant perspective to get what I want. You know, if I say I want Thai, I'm not going to go to an Italian restaurant. And then if you're me, you probably do a little bit of online research, figure out where's the best Thai restaurant in town? Where should I go? Find out what other people say and probably even what they're recommending I get there. I'm going to select the location and let everybody know, okay, we're meeting at this restaurant at 6 o'clock on Thursday. And we're going to sit down, look at the menu and place our orders and say, hey, you know, could you do this, but put the salad dressing on the side? And really be kind of specific about what it is we're looking for. And then finally, we're going to taste the finished product. If it's super good, I might even write a review myself. I'm not really that type of person, but these are the sorts of things that I would do as I was eating that meal. These are also the same things that we're going to do as we work our way through identifying a contract manufacturing partner, doing all the tech transfer, and ultimately creating and overseeing the product that we're making there. Next up, please. So if we break it down into those same sorts of steps, step one, what do I want? How do I want to have it made? So define the requirements and specifications for the product that you want to have made. You may say, oh, I want to have an oral drug. Well, Are you talking about a horse pill or a tablet? What type of oral is it? Immediate release? Is it extended release? Those sorts of things. Really define what it is that you're looking for. Think about the risks and important factors that you'll need to consider during manufacturing, both risks to patient as well as risk to the operators. Is this a highly potent compound that I need to make sure that my new vendors know about and can take protective care for? We need to figure out forecasting and how much do I need? Do I need to have inventory set aside? And when do I need to have all of this available? Oftentimes for a clinical study, we'll have, I want first patient in on this date. But we have a tendency to forget about all of the steps that have to happen before we get to that patient. We need to do tech transfer, development, clinical readiness, validation, and honestly, manufacture the product itself. We also need to think about the regulations and quality standards that both the product and the facility need to meet. Is it going to be FDA regulated? Are you selling into Europe or Asia? Is there, do you need to have an ISO certification at your manufacturing site? And figure out all of those things before you start trying to find a vendor. Because you don't want to say, oh, this vendor would be great. Yeah, but they're not certified. Or, yeah, but they don't really work in this space. Let's identify what our space is and what our boundaries are before we start searching. And finally, we need to establish a budget. We need to know how much we're going to be able to spend and the timelines in which it can go out. It's not enough to say, oh, I've got $500,000. It's knowing roughly what your plan is so that you can relay that to a vendor and let them say, oh yeah, I can make that happen, or not so much. So our next step then is starting to look at who our best vendors are going to be. This goes back to what I was talking about. I go on Yelp and figure out who the best Thai restaurant might be. So you're going to do the same. You're going to conduct some online research. Who is capable of making this product that you want to have made? You're also going to look at your colleagues, your friends, and see who they've worked with, what's worked out well for them, what hasn't. And ultimately, you're going to compile kind of a short list of potential partners. And then once you've done that, start reaching out. Have some initial discussions with those vendors of, oh, could you make this? I want to have an instrument that's in a hot pink box. Can you make that? And they'll say yes or no. And if no, then move on, take them off the short list and find a partner who can. But you don't want to give them too much information at this stage because you haven't established any sort of IP protection. So our very next step is to establish that IP protection. It's starting, next slide, please. Starting to put NDAs and CDAs in place with the vendors that you've already established, in theory, could make you that hot pink box. And once you have that in place and you're comfortable that your intellectual property is going to remain your own, then you start looking at building a request for proposal. Advance 2, please. One more. And what we do within that RFP is really provide our vendors with all the information they're going to need to know in order to both be able to sort of make the product, but more importantly, quote on what it would take to make that product. So the first section is a lot about you. Who do you work for? What's your contact information and general product definition? This is pretty high level stuff. And you'll be like, oh, they should know. You want to have it in the RFP so that they know who to contact. They don't have to go back and find your email where you sent the RFP. You're going to include some project details, such as an overview of what your product is, why it's important, as well as your product specifications, some specifics around what it is, and your estimated project timelines and budget. This is going to allow them to know, how long do we have to make this work? Do I need to put more resources on it now? So instead of one person for 6 months, could I do 2 people for 4? Those sorts of things, which ultimately will impact what they're able to respond back on their proposal with. And then you want to include your manufacturing specifications. So things around, what do you know about your product? How is it currently made, at least in your development lab? And what are the specifics that might play into how they are going to have to manufacture this? If you need a sterile product or sterile packaging, those are special treatments that they're going to need to make sure that their facility is capable of handling. And then you're also going to want to let them know what your testing requirements and methodologies are. If you need to test for heavy metals, tell them that, because they may have a test already developed that's kind of a platform method they could use, or it might be something they need to develop, in which case they'll need time and budget included in that proposal for that. And finally, we want to talk about regulatory requirements. Where is this product destined to be used? What regulations and certifications do they need to have in order to be able to produce this product and for you to disposition it for use in the appropriate locations? And finally, if you want to have an in-person audit with them before you go GMP, tell them now. They might as well know everything up front so that you can build that relationship right out of the gate. All right, next slide, please. So, one too many. So as you've gotten your RFPs out, you're now going to start receiving those proposals back. And we're going to need, you want to make sure that you're analyzing apples to apples or oranges to oranges. And a lot of what that means is you digest each of the proposals and make sure that the sections that are in one are in the other if they're important to you, or that you can line out the sections that you're not interested in. For example, one company might have included a cost for stability where another didn't. And so you'd want to go back to that second vendor and say, hey, could you do this? If so, what would the pricing look like? What conditions are you able to support? Those sorts of things, so that you really know between all of your vendors who's capable of what and how much it's truly going to cost. And then ultimately it comes down to you and your team picking which vendor, which partner they want to move forward with. Okay, now next. So that comes down to step 4. We're gonna pick a restaurant. We're gonna commit. This is where we're going. And in picking that, we want to look at cost effectiveness, technical capabilities, maybe even their capacity constraints, because there are going to be some vendors that say, oh yeah, I can do this and I can get you to 10 kilos. Sounds like a lot, probably is a lot. But if you need 100 kilos and you don't have time to run that 10 times, then that's maybe not the vendor for you. So think about all of those sorts of things as you're going through it. And of course, consider those quality reputations and the reviews that you've gotten to know how much credence you can really put on these quotations. Everyone goes in with the best of intentions and they say, this is what we expect to happen. But a lot of it is based off of everything going right. So mentally think about what happens when something goes wrong. What's that going to do to my timeline, my budget, etc. And kind of factor that in as you're making this decision. So now that we've picked a restaurant, we're ready to start handling some tech transfer. Next slide, please. This is where we're going to finally sit down with people actually doing the work, not just the business development guy who said, oh yeah, we can do that, no problem. But meet with the technical team and have people from the technical teams from both sides of the table get together. And the very first thing you want to do is review the contract. Make sure that everybody in the room understands what has been agreed to and come up with some communication and escalation plans. Who's the primary point of contact for packaging? Who's going to be the primary point of contact for synthetic work or for machining? And just establish those lines of communication. We want to talk through the specifications again with the technical folks, because remember, these are the ones that are actually going to make it happen. And so make sure that they understand what the requirements are and can voice questions or concerns and help work with you to meet those specifications long term. You're also going to take a look at some detailed timelines and understand that this is your first pass, but this is what we think is going to happen and when we think it's going to happen. And everyone align on that. I have had instances where the contracts team said, oh yeah, we're going to get all that sent over in the first month. And I said, yeah, but it's got to go through customs and that takes 3 weeks. Which means I now have 1 week to get all of this shipped out. And that's not going to happen. So really work through it and figure out what is realistic. And then if you had any additional considerations that were added into that quote, things like stability or validation, or even raw data sharing, make sure that those are communicated up front so that everybody on the team knows what is going to be required of them and when do they need to have it done. As the sponsor, please provide all the historic documentation that you can. You may not have a heck of a lot, or you might have a full data room with thousands of pages of documentation. Don't send the whole data room. Nobody has time to read that. But do talk with the team and find out what would be helpful for them and make sure that they get those documents at a minimum. If you have a generic production batch record, send it. If you've got analytical test methods, send those. Even though those things are going to need to be modified at the new site, having something to start from will get you a long way in terms of getting through the project quickly. And finally, establish a collaborative information exchange. You're going to want to have some routine meetings, and this is not just through the tech transfer phase, but on it through production as well. Establish roles and responsibilities. Who's going to write? Who's going to sign? How are we going to run these regular meetings? Think about a quality agreement. If you're going to establish one, now's a good time to start thinking through what would be in that. And finally, probably, to be honest, most importantly, figure out how you're going to share documentation. This could be a SharePoint portal. It could be something that's hosted by your contract manufacturer. In any case, it could even just be emails. In any case, establish how you're going to communicate and how these things are going to get back and forth between you. And then ultimately, long-term, hang on to the documentation that's sent over. Don't make the assumption that 6 years from now, you're going to be able to go back and retrieve it from your contract manufacturer when you haven't talked to them in 2 or 3 years. You can, it's just going to take far more time than you want. Next slide, please.
I should maybe, before we move on, I think
Yes.
another thing that really is important to discuss with the vendor up front is what their willingness is to have you on site. So if you're a formulator and it's really important for you to be in the lab and seeing the work being done and get the touch and the feel of the product, some vendors won't allow you to be in their site. Some of them will allow you to come and just be in the meeting room rather than going into the lab itself. Usually nobody will allow you into a GMP suite when manufacturing is going on, but it's important to have that discussion ahead of time so you understand what the limitations are and how they line up with what's important to you.
It's a very good point. Thank you. All right. So now we're into the oversight. We've transferred all the information, sort of. At least we talked about transferring. And ultimately, we need to build that relationship. This is going to be a long-term partnership between the sponsor and the vendor. And you want to make sure that you have a solid flow of communication in both directions. And ultimately, empower your vendors with knowledge. Let them understand why this is super cool and why they want to help you succeed. And then, of course, let them know that you're going to be there. Whether it's in person or virtually, you're going to be involved throughout the whole process. And you want them to feel free to reach out at any time. You're going to schedule some routine meetings. And as we had talked about before, I would strongly encourage you to do an audit before moving to GMP production. This might be in person, this might be paper. It's all a matter of what your processes require and what you're able to negotiate with your vendors. But ultimately, this is your opportunity to taste the product. You got to make sure that what is being produced meets all of your standards and meets all of the regulatory requirements, because ultimately, as the sponsor, it's your responsibility to disposition this product, and FDA is going to come knocking on your door when they want to do an audit. So review everything: quality events, raw data, batch records, finished goods inspections, reports, protocols, everything, and keep a copy. You know, set up an archive somewhere that this is where all of my GMP data goes, and hold on to it, because eventually there is going to be somebody come knocking and say, hey, what about X, Y, or Z? And you're going to say, oh yeah, so-and-so did that. And you'll be like, yeah, I don't remember, or I need a copy of. And let's face it, the agency doesn't like to wait. So the sooner you can provide them whatever information they're looking for, the better. So if you keep a copy, you're golden. You can pull it up in 5-10 minutes versus potentially needing to wait several hours to hear back from a vendor. But overall, this is a trust but verify situation. We've built the relationship. We know that everybody's doing everything that they can to make this a successful product, make it the way that it's supposed to be made. We just need to make sure that all of the documentation aligns and that everything is actually being done as written. That way, we are able to put out a product that we know is safe to go into a patient or to be used at the bedside, and is going to actually produce the overall results that we're hoping for, or at least that we're looking to test. And so with that, that's kind of where we end up, is how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, but you're going to need some friends. Okay, I think
All right.
that's the last one.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was great. And thank you for the input as well, Derek. I believe there was one question.
Yeah,
All
so
right,
I typed in a response to the question, but maybe I don't know if Teresa wants to respond or Alex as well, because this is a quality question. But the question was whether or not typically an audit is scheduled before the contract is signed. And if so, what financial terms are recommended?
Yeah, so I think there are several schools of thoughts on that. I think for me personally, I think managing supplier is one of the core responsibility of the quality management role. So I think performing an audit before or after signing a contract is really ultimately a consideration of risk. Now, your CDMO or the contract manufacturer that does your finished product, you're the one that for medical devices or for pharmaceuticals, it's one of the most critical subcontractors you can engage in your operation. So therefore, I don't know of any regulatory requirement that mandates you must do that before you sign a contract or a quality agreement. But I think from my perspective, I would highly recommend that for the reasons that Teresa had previously stated. And also, I think what's more importantly is that this is a human interaction. This is going to be a relationship between your people and your partner's people. So therefore, I think establishing that contact in like sort of in the early stages of your interaction is going to be crucial for the collaboration or for the success of the collaboration that you're going to have later on. So yes, I mean, the answer is yes, I would highly recommend that you would do an audit before you sign the contract, whether that be like a remote desktop audit or you actually come up in person. So that interaction early on is very, very important. It sets the tone for the rest of the engagement as well.
And my experience aligns fairly well with what Derek had indicated. You absolutely want to have that in place before you move into a GMP setting. But oftentimes, before you've signed a contract, there's not enough information that a vendor could provide to make the audit really worthwhile. They'd have to be looking at it from the 50,000 foot level. Here's maybe our quality system. Here's what we've done for internal processes, but they aren't going to have any of your own data to share with you or to really discuss in an audit.
Right, and just with the time commitment, both for the sponsor and for the CDMO, if you wouldn't want to audit 3 CDMOs before picking one. So normally you would sign the contract and then schedule the audit, but you could ask for a questionnaire to be responded to give you kind of a sense of what the quality systems are like at the CDMO before picking one, just to make sure that they're not really out of whack with what your expectations are. But definitely, I think audit before GMP manufacturing at the vendor is certainly a good idea, so that there's no surprises.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the question, Dimitri. So let's now transition into our panel discussion so we can dive a bit further into some of the concepts that Teresa had gone over. So as discussed in the presentation, it seems like laying that foundation for robust request for proposal is very important. So I'm interested to hear from Alex as well as Derek, both from a CDMO and quality perspective. What are particular aspects of an RFP that you believe are highly significant that you often see sponsors overlook or potentially leave out?
Do you want to go first, Alex, or should I?
Sure. Yeah, so there are several aspects that come to mind when it comes to the early stages or the RFP stage of the engagement. So the first thing I want to really sort of emphasize is not necessarily something that's always overlooked, but is somewhat a prerequisite for a lot of the things that happen later on, is for your technical and quality teams to establish that connection with their counterparts really early in the engagement process, because that really opens up the channel for a lot of the more detailed discussion that could happen, early on, to identify problems, to identify red flags. Now, no obviously no disrespect for our sales colleagues, but at the same time, a lot of the times when you are getting into that level of detail when it comes to quality management and technical intricacies is a lot easier if you have the right people to reach out to, even though it's still early on in the process. Now, the second point I want to bring out is the regulatory history of the site or the regulatory history of the company that you're about to engage on. Even at the RFP stage, you can already get quite a bit of information on that. There are several channels which I think is very, very effective at getting that. So one of the things is the FDA inspection history, which is public information that's freely available on the FDA website. And also, when it comes to regulatory history, you want to kind of construct a holistic view on the vendor, on the site itself. A lot of the international regulators also have this on their publicly available information portal as well. One of the examples is Health Canada. They will give you inspection details on the particular site that you're looking for. And also, I know the Australian TGA also has a non-conformity sort of publication portal as well. And each of the European competent authorities would also have the GMP certification and the non-conformity history published on their site as well. The only ones that aren't available are the smaller sort of regulators, like the Korean KFDA or the Japanese regulators as well. So, but all in all, is that this is a very effective way for you to even before visiting the site or conducting any of your own audits, have a pretty well-rounded view on the regulatory history of the site. So this is a way to actually offload some of that risk from your process to the CDMO that you're about to engage, because you know that there are regulators already looking at their quality system, on a regular basis. So therefore, you can actually later on dedicate more of your focus on the things that are related to your products and services that they're going to provide you later on. So that focus is going to help you manage your resources more effectively. Now, the last point is, I think that this is actually one that is often overlooked, is that how are they going to interact with your suppliers, and how are they going to interact with the key suppliers that is going to be crucial for the success of your process and products. Because a lot of the times you will nominate your own suppliers and they will have an onboarding process. But I think understanding that early on will avoid a lot of the sort of surprises that might come up later. So this is something that I would recommend to do as early as you possibly can.
Good feedback.
Yeah. Maybe just to provide a little bit of a nuance in terms of the regulatory inspection history of sites. So typically for non-commercial sites, the FDA does not inspect them. So they typically will prioritize inspecting sites that are commercial. So if you're looking for an early development site that's focusing on being that fast and flexible site to get you into phase 1, many of the smaller players will never have been inspected. So the current site where I'm at now has been inspected by the FDA, but that is not really the norm for early development. So don't necessarily be too put off if the site doesn't have an inspection history from a regulatory agency, if it's early development that you're looking at. But yeah, in terms of what information I would like from a potential sponsor, really it's helpful for the CDMO to understand kind of what are the critical priorities for the sponsor for the project. What are the most important things to make that project either a success or a failure? So is it timing? Like, do you need to get the IND filed to come hell or high water by X date, and that's the most critical thing? Or is there a particular quality parameter that needs to be in place for the product? Like, is it a product for somebody that has trouble swallowing? So if the drug load is too low and you end up with too large a pill, that's not going to be something that you can dose. Like, maybe that's a critical thing. Or is it budget? Like, you need to make sure that for the finances of the project to work out, it needs to be below a certain budget threshold. That the CDMO should know which one of those things is really most critical to make sure that they're tailoring their proposal to meet your needs best. I think the other thing that's really helpful is if you can articulate what are, and I think Teresa mentioned this in terms of the technical information on the project, or what are the what is there a particular technical challenge you're trying to solve? Like, does this product have a challenge with being with showing bioavailability in animals, and you think that might be the same thing in humans, and that should be something that the CDMO should be focused on. Do you know that the synthetic route has a really low yield at a particular step, and that should be optimized? Like anything that you can share in terms of what are the major problems or challenges in previous development done on the product that the vendor should keep in mind in addressing in their proposal is also extremely helpful.
Great feedback, Derek. Thank you. Teresa, do you have anything to add?
No, I think they covered it really well.
So too.
I have one more thing to add, actually. So the other thing, which is often that I would take consideration at the early stage, is also the potential sort of supplier sponsor dynamics later on. Now, let me just clarify that a little bit more. Is that a lot of the times as startups or like a smaller company, we would have a range of sizes when it comes to CDMOs. I think that's actually quite significant when it comes to the dynamics later on. So basically, for example, is your business going to be like 1% out of 100 clients, or is it going to be one client out of 1,000 clients that they're going to have? So that is a consideration of what kind of relationship is going to come out of as your engagement sort of evolves later on as well. So that will dictate how much resources later on the CDMO would be able to provide your product and processes, as opposed to, for example, the likes of Pfizer, which could be probably 50% of their revenue. So that is one consideration for the business, especially smaller size businesses in early development.
Great. Thank you for that, Alex. All right. So I guess moving on to one of our next questions, I really wanted the team to explore some of the effective strategies to guarantee that the CDMO would have the appropriate expertise, equipment, and facilities in order to make the sponsor successful. So my question for the group is, what kind of resources or evidence would you consider the most valuable assessing whether a CDMO meets these specific criteria?
I would probably ask for some history up front. How many of this sort of product or projects have they worked on? How many of this phase have they been successfully involved with? And it could be, oh yeah, we just bought the piece of equipment. We've only just begun working with it. And that's fine, but you want to understand what's there and what capabilities they do really have. And some of it is just going to be checking with their references, even though you assume that, oh, they're only going to give me referrals for people that liked my work or whatever. They're not going, the person that they refer you to is still going to be able to tell you, oh, this went wrong and here's how we dealt with it, and kind of get a feel for how that process works on their side, because there's something that goes wrong in every program. This is not new or unique.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think one of the things that I actually always incorporate into a supplier evaluation process is to ask the question of whether this is their core business. As in, core business has two dimensions. One dimension is whether this is actually what they do. If you are trying to make a medical device, for example, is the device their specialty, or do they make something that's completely different and they are developing a new capability on the devices that you are trying to make, and then you are one of the first clients in doing that. So is this their strategically, is this their core business? That's one dimension. And the other dimension is, where do they sit on the logistic chain, or the stages of that logistic chain for that particular process? Are they more specialized in large scale manufacturing and you're in early stage, or the other way around, when you're sort of wanting to have a larger scale of products, and then they're in sort of the R&D space. So these are all key considerations when it comes to making sure that it can be a successful sort of process later on being developed. So I think to Teresa's point, I think this is one of the other things that we can consider.
Yeah, and I think I really don't have anything new to add, but I think just maybe to build on what's been said before is really to try and understand what the depth of technical expertise is at the CDMO, really to try and also get an understanding on who would be the technical experts that you're working with. So you might be in a situation where you're working with the A team at the proposal stage, and then all of a sudden when you get your project team, it's a bunch of recent college grads that have a lot less experience. So it'd be good to try and get an understanding on what the composition of the project team might be when the project was awarded, and then also to understand like what might be the mechanisms available to you as a sponsor during the execution of the project to pull back in some of the larger technical experts at the company, which might be above site or might not be within the individual project team in order to overcome a particular hurdle you might encounter. Not that we ever have any project problems here with anything, but I hear they exist.
Never, right?
Yeah.
Never happens.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for that. Were you going to say something else, Alex?
Yeah, and something just came to mind as we're going through this is that as a quality management professional, I think a lot of the times, it's the time could be a challenge when it comes to sort of scheduling an audit like really early on in the process. But at the same time, I think a personal visit or like a in-person visit is something that is not replaceable by someone holding the camera and walking around the facility. So I think a lot of the times it actually justifies the cost by actually just paying a visit, because a lot of the times you visit a facility and you ask yourself, what is your gut feeling about this place? What is your gut feeling about their ability to actually meet your requirements? A lot of the times you will, as you gain experience in quality management, you'll be able to identify things that are not shown on paper, that are not, written down on quality agreements, but you'll be able to see that and go, okay, that needs improvement before we can actually proceed with an engagement.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. The personal site visit is really, really important to evaluate a vendor. That's different from an audit, but yeah, no, something I would absolutely recommend doing as well.
Great insights. All right, so next question. Let's talk about risk mitigation. Quality management professionals' favorite topic, right, Alex? So from each of your perspectives, you all kind of represent different stakeholders in the process: sponsor, CDMO, strategic partner. What have you found have been the most common risks encountered during technology transfer? And based on your experiences, what tactics have you seen been most effective for your teams in addressing and mitigating these risks?
All right, I can start with this one. I think my experience has really been that the risks that you encounter with projects are highly project dependent, and it's going to depend on the unique product you're working on, what its particular risk profile is, and what needs to be mitigated. So it might be, the risk of that the polymorph is going to change, that the product's not stable, that you're going to get new impurities forming. It may be around the quality attributes, like you're trying to get a really something with a palatable flavor because it's going to be a pediatric indication, and you can't get rid of you can't taste mask the taste of the active ingredient. So it's really going to depend on the product. But I would say that really what's important when you're looking at a vendor is to try and understand what tools the vendor has available to them that are not part of the scope that you originally set out upon. So like, they may have given you a proposal for what they're going to do in terms of formulation development and manufacturing, but do they have other capabilities beyond that if something unexpected happens? Like, can they figure out what the new impurity is and synthesize a small quantity of it and make a reference standard if you need to add that into your analytical method, you've now identified a new impurity that you have to quantitate as an example. So I think it's good to understand in order to mitigate your risks in your project, what other things you might encounter that you don't expect in the project and what capabilities that vendor has to solve those problems, as opposed to you needing to go out and finding another vendor to solve those problems for you when the event happens.
Really great feedback.
I think you're spot on, Derek. It's those technical risks that you can already kind of identify coming in as, we know that this might be a problem, and making sure that you start talking about those early and often, and how are we going to deal with it? What are we going to do to address them? And not just crossing our fingers and hoping it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the like you guys have already covered, the risk can really come out from any part of the topics that we talked about earlier. It can be equipment compatibility, it could be logistic compatibility, it could be, you know, even interaction with other key suppliers. So from my perspective, I think a lot of the times it really helps you to focus down on the right topics. It's more or less like a test of your understanding of the process. So like Teresa had already indicated, that if you know where things are going to go wrong, if you know that the details of the things that could come about, given the information about the supplier and their tools available to solve the problem, where could that go wrong? For example, like if you want to do your purification steps, is the resin available? If it's not available, can they test a new one? Is there going to be any differences in terms of the quality attributes that come out from the new process? And so a lot of the groundworks that you've done earlier now will enable you to concentrate on this stuff. For example, let's say if they have a ISO 9001 certification, or if they have a GMP certification already from a different from various regulators, now you know someone is already looking at their generic quality processes. Like, you don't have to focus on their documentation, for example, because you know somebody's already looking at that. You don't have to focus on their maybe like management review, for example. You know that their notified body, maybe for their ISO 13485 certification, is already looking at that. So therefore, you just focus on the unique problems that could be arising from your own process. And one of the good things that medical devices had introduced into my career that I think ought to be sort of more useful in the pharmaceutical space is a process risk analysis. I find that very few people in the pharmaceutical sector actually end up using that. It's a way to quantify and categorize risk and identify mitigations for those risks. And I think in the construction of that risk analysis, it's a very good exercise because it forces you to think about your process from a very from a very objective and quantified manner. So therefore, after you actually constructed the risk analysis, I think that document is going to serve as a good starting point for you to identify where things might come from. And then at that point in time, you might already have a column where that says, okay, here are the potential risk mitigations from what we understand about the process.
And I do think having a solid project manager who's walked this process many times and can identify some of the risks as they're coming down the pipe is really helpful. I came at one point out of the pharmaceutical industry, and we didn't do a lot of project management work. And having seen how that can function and does function in other areas, specifically the diagnostic space, it's really helpful to have that guide who can say, oh, this might be a problem. Let's keep an eye on it, rather than just going along and having it pop up suddenly and trying to figure out what to do about it at that point.
Yeah. That's a perfect segue, actually, Teresa, into my final question here. So, once a sponsor has completed the vendor and qualification process, and now they've moved forward with their partner selection, what do you think, from each of your perspectives, is the most crucial factor in ensuring effective collaboration and oversight with your new partner? So, for example, is it good project management, like Teresa just noted, a well-executed quality agreement that's been discussed, effective communication plans? Just interested to hear each of your perspectives on this.
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that all of the above are important. But as a quality manager by trade, I think one of the things that I want to emphasize to other quality managers and probably businesses in general is that don't rely on your annual supplier audit to identify problems, and don't rely on the quality agreement to kind of mitigate as a risk mitigation. You need to take a holistic approach on your most valuable and most risky suppliers in your portfolio. So that is, it's almost like managing your staff member, your employees by their employment contract and annual performance review, as your only tool in your tool belt to manage their performance. So I think it ultimately is an interaction which is complex. So therefore, you have to take that into consideration. So you need to keep a look out for their regulatory certifications, their regulatory histories, and their other problems that might come out, and your regular interactions and your regular paces of meetings. And on top of that, the audit and the supplier agreement is definitely one sector or two of the tools that you can utilize to manage the supplier, which again is at the highest risk level when it comes to your supplier management portfolio.
I tend to come to fall on the communication side. All of these things that you've listed, Lindsay, are actually just related to how do we communicate with one another. It could be through documentation like a quality agreement. It could be through a project manager, but ultimately we need to have that open communication throughout the entire thing, regardless of who's leading it.
Yeah, I completely agree with Teresa. I think definitely communication is the most important thing. Although I do think all of these aspects are important. I think communication is probably the most important thing. I think it's important for you to define to the vendor who they need to communicate what to on your side. So they may just get in the habit of talking to one person, but if the rest of the team also needs to know, I think you need to share that with the CDMO. Yeah, you might want to consider having one-on-one calls with the project manager as well, because sometimes you get more free communication on smaller groups than you would if you're just only interacting with them in the team meeting when it's a large group on both sides. That's probably something worth considering. I think it's good to understand who you can escalate to above the project team if you run into an issue, whether that's the business development person or somebody in management at the site that can maybe help get the project back on track. And then I think you should also make it clear to the sponsor who they should, or what should trigger an escalation on their side. So if they can see that something is running off the rails in terms of budget, and you've made it clear to them that you can't have the budget go over, they need to know to talk to you as soon as the scope of the project is going to impact on the budget before any work gets done. So just being clear to them on what the critical parameters for success are for the project, and when they need to raise a flag and communicate with you that we're about to make a change that would impact one of them. But yeah, I agree with communication.
Great. Thank you, Derek. And it looks like you guys have been answering the questions throughout. So thank you, Derek, for providing those answers. We do have one open question from Dimitri. So do you expect CDMO to be your one-stop shop? Do you expect, for example, to have an additional organization for analytical method development and qualification?
And I had started typing, so this actually will be a lot faster. Yes, I think that you may have a CDMO that can do quite a bit of what you're looking for. They might be able to do the manufacturing and the analytical, but I wouldn't expect that they'd be able to do everything. So there are going to be situations and instances where the CDMO may say, hey, I can't do the micro testing. Are you okay if I send it out to this facility? Or where you've hired them to do drug product and they're not really situated to do drug substance. Everything doesn't always have to happen in-house, and it doesn't always have to be at one facility. And as you move between phases of development, specifically like phase 1 versus phase 3 in a pharmaceutical setting, you're very likely going to want to add additional vendors or people who specialize in those new phases so that you're getting the support that you need at the stage that you're currently at.
Yeah, so that often adds an additional layer of supplier management exercise that you have to do. That brings me to the earlier point which I made is about the supplier interactions of your CDMO with other suppliers. So let's say, for example, if they nominate a testing laboratory or a developer for your methods, then how are they going to manage that relationship, or are you going to manage that relationship? So that is something that you have to work out with your CDMO in that exercise.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're at time. Thank you so much for this discussion. Very valuable insights. And if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to our subject matter experts. You can use their contact information here, and they'd be happy to address any additional questions that you have. On behalf of Sequoia, we sincerely appreciate your participation and engagement, and just a huge shout out to our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing such wealth of knowledge, as well as your lessons learned in these critical areas. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.